What's up, everybody? Jeff here, and I have collected a panel of, let's say, experts. Let's say experts, because we're going to be talking about the Explorer Society, and in particular, we're going to be answering the question that I see asked constantly, all the time. Maybe one of the most common questions that I see for new players in the Malifaux community, which is which masters are beginner friendly, which masters are not so beginner friendly. Who should I start off with? So, if you're coming into this video, we're kind of assuming that you've already decided that you want to play Explorer Society. If you're not sure that you want to play Explorer Society, then I have a whole series of videos to help people decide who they want to play based on the rule of cool. But assuming that you know you want to play Explorers and you are trying to decide who to play, we're going to have a conversation here and kind of help you decide who might be a good first choice and who to maybe steer away from if you're worried about that sort of thing. So I don't play Explorer Society, but I do play against them quite a bit. But I have a couple of friends here who do. So we have Mr. Jesse from Boring
Hey,
Conversation.
everybody. How's it going?
We have my buddy Kevin, who beats me up with Explorer Society all the time.
How you doing?
And we have Miles, a member of the community, who I think also plays against Explorers primarily, right?
Howdy. Yeah, I got McCabe, and I've played against him a few times.
Okay. So hopefully a variety of opinions and expertise levels, but let's jump right into it. I'm gonna go down the list on Weird's website. We're gonna kind of talk about each one. We're gonna consider a handful of factors. So one of those is just gonna be kind of the overall, like obviously Malifaux is a complicated game, period. But we're gonna consider the overall complexity of the master and their crew. How many moving parts are there? How many complicated interactions are there? We're gonna consider things like crews that have a lot of options or different things going on that lead to decision paralysis for new players. I think that's a big problem that folks have in a lot of the more complicated miniatures games. Mechanics that are hard to remember because they trigger at weird times, so they're going to lead to kind of frustrating moments for a lot of people. Something that I think will probably factor in a little bit less, but may be important to some people, is things that are a financial barrier to getting into that crew. So if it requires that you buy a lot of extra models, or you have to have like special equipment or markers or things like that, something that might affect your decision. And then the last thing is models that are or models or crews that are very easy to be punished when you're playing them. So things where when you make a very simple mistake, it can ruin your entire game. I think that might be relevant in some cases. So some of those will be more relevant to some crews, but we'll kind of get into it as we go. So let's start off with Mr. Base, who is the first on Weird's list of Explorer Society masters. Do any of you play Base or have any significant familiarity with him?
Yeah. I've played him a number of times, and I've played against him quite a bit as well. He's I think that he's probably at face value one of the better masters for like a new player. Honestly, he's a pretty easy to approach master for anybody, not just in Explorers, but in Guild as well. The mechanics are pretty straightforward, not a ton of complexity to them. I think one thing that's really cool about this crew is that there's not a lot of those like passive effects and auras and stuff that comes up during your opponent's turn that is very easy to miss. A lot of times if you're playing one of those crews that has lots of those passive effects, you miss out on it, and well, you know, the crew's only operating at fraction of the efficiency that it could. Yeah, I mean, I think he's pretty cool. There are some issues with fragility in the list. Like a lot of the models can kind of get blown out if you overextend them, and their front of card ability lets you overextend them on turn one. So that's a fine balance to strike. Come to find out, you don't actually have to deploy like 8 inches past your deployment zone edge. So don't do that unless you actually think you need to.
So he lets you, depending on the number of models in the crew that have the ability, he lets you extend your deployment out, which obviously there's a risk involved with that. I played him like early in 3rd edition, and my recollection was, like you said, I think everything in the crew is pretty much like had its particular role. There wasn't anything that was overly complicated. He did have some like marker placement stuff, but I think it was pretty much just the one, like the dust cloud mechanic that comes up frequently. So it's not super complicated. You kind of figure out how it works, and it just you keep doing it. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on it? I know you have been looking into playing him.
Yeah, I mean, he seems like a lot of fun to play. He was easy for me to understand at a glance, so that's good. And I feel like the extended deployment zone, he is pretty forgiving because you spend less time doing unnecessary walk actions, and it's more forgiving because a lot of these deployment zones can be very uh crowded, like in the active areas, especially wedge deployment. That's the one that goes up the middle, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, so that can be really hard to deploy effectively, and if you're not used to the game.
Yeah. Miles, have you had any experience with him on the table?
Bass? I think I played against him once, maybe. Um, Home on the range, yeah, you can get out there far, but the problem is if you're out there too far, somebody hits back even harder, then you're just dead. The crew has a lot of healing. You got a stoic nod, which that's always great to be able to heal somebody from over there and be like, "You good, man?"
Mhm.
Yeah. There's a lot of survivalists. I think that's supposed to be their kind of comfort zone, kind of defensive. It's like a kind of weirdly defensive countermeasure kind of thing for them.
Right.
But they don't really have like a lot of armor besides like one model. There is disguise. But yeah, they're mostly a crew that wants to be up close and fight, but they don't have like a lot of that. I'm just gonna stand here and take all these hits kind of feel to them.
Mm-hmm.
So you can get punished quickly if somebody like really runs in and tries to take out a key model, but if they don't, then you have the ability to sort of recover from that with the healing abilities.
Yeah, it's like it. The crew being able to deploy past its deployment zone it sounds great in theory, and in practice it can be really powerful. But if you end up playing into an enemy that is like very fast, has a lot of really hard hitting models that can get to you before you get a chance to activate your models.
Right.
A lot of times the distance that you are from each other on turn one is the best defense to making sure your models don't get killed. And this crew in general, it has like relatively low stats on a lot of the models. There's a lot of stat 4s, 5s, and not really everything has like hard to wound, hard to kill. There's not a lot of armor going around. So if your models just get blown out before you get a chance to heal them, it can be a little demoralizing. But what I would say to a new player is, just honestly, just don't use home on the range until you feel like you've got a good sense of the crew and the matchup. Because your opponent's going to come to you no matter what. And I don't really feel like home on the range is a critical ability. You can kind of play without it until you learn how to play with it. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. So don't overextend if you're not sure that it's the right choice because you're too new. I think that makes sense. So what I'm thinking here is for each crew, let's kind of rank them as either beginner friendly, somewhere intermediate, or challenging. Keep it pretty straightforward. What are you guys thinking for base in terms of approachability for a new player?
Very easy.
I'd say he's pretty new player friendly. Lots of guns. Guns are really good to learn with because you don't have to actually get punched in melee. Lots of flexibility, lots of healing, and as long as you're not getting too aggressive with your models, they should stick around. And some pretty quick stuff in here too. Yeah, I'd say they're pretty new player friendly.
I think I'd agree.
Miles, I heard you say something, but I didn't catch it. Did you say?
Oh yeah, they're very easy to get into. You have a gun, shoot.
And it's a good gun too. His gun at least. All right, so bass or base. I can never. There was a way I pronounced it, and then I found out it was the wrong way, and then I can't remember now.
I think it's just bass. I think it's just bass.
Pronunciation.
Yeah, I will say too that obviously all these crews really have gotten new models that are in some cases kind of like patches to some outstanding weaknesses of the crew.
Right.
And Clipper, the new Frontier and augmented model, is really, really, really good and helps the crew out. Yeah, there it is. It helps the crew out a whole lot, and it's a really cool looking model too. So I think that just it being added plus Bass 2, Badland Sheriff, being a little bit, I think just kind of a little better across the board, really kind of breathes some new life into the crew. The Dust Cloud mechanics suddenly start working better because you have the ability to keep them on the table instead of them all going away at the end of the turn. Yeah, I think that especially if you're using Badland Sheriff and you have some of those more burly, durable models, the crew is fantastic.
Cool. Yeah, just to clarify for anybody who might not be aware yet, but in Malifaux, the masters all now have title versions, which are like an alternate skin that has some different abilities. So what Jesse was just talking about is like you're allowed to play instead of the original.
I was just going to agree. I love the dust cloud mechanics on Bass too. It just seems like a fun way to play, and it's very easy to understand. You drop your big, obnoxious, severe terrain where it makes sense, to jam up your enemy or to cover your own guys.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So I think beginner friendly. Go for it if you're interested in Bass. Then jump in.
Great aesthetic
Oh
too.
yeah.
He's got swagger.
Yeah. I think he's one of the more interesting. I think the whole crew, honestly. I mean, Bass himself and Bernadette, I think, are great, but I think the whole crew is interesting. Like Malifaux's known for like the Western aesthetic, and it's really not that common among the models, but that's one of the ones where
I think he might be one of the only like actual kind of good guys in the lore too, right?
That's
like
true.
there's not many of them in Malifaux.
No.
Everybody's kind of a dirtbag. He's not.
He's a nice guy.
Yeah, he's a nice guy. I think he's got some interesting stories in the lore as well. So if you are into that type of thing, definitely go check it out. But let's go over to Lucas McCabe. Speaking of not so nice guys, so McCabe is someone who I actually played a lot in second edition. I haven't played him as much in third edition, but my perception of McCabe is that he's probably a little bit higher or quite a bit higher on the complexity level, and a big part of that reason is going to be because his primary mechanic has him handing out upgrades. And not only is that a complicated thing to plan for and kind of figure out where you're going to put those upgrades and when, but you also have to juggle, the knowledge of the abilities of the upgrades. So this is not just here's my model card and what it can do. It's also like here's these 4 or 5 other options that I could have if I do the proper preparation, and then what can I do with my models in those cases. So there's a lot of decision points, there's a lot of knowledge that you have to know and kind of things to juggle. So my thought would be he would be quite a bit higher on the complexity level. But Jesse, have you played much McCabe?
Yeah, he's one of my primary 3 Explorers Masters, so I played him a lot. And I would tend to agree. He's definitely more complex than frankly most of the other masters in the faction.
Yeah.
The thing with him is that his complexity is mostly just kind of on turn 1, to be honest. And if you do his deployment correctly and you do his unpack correctly and you activate models in the correct order, it's the difference between getting out like 2 or 3 upgrades in a given turn and like maybe 1. And it's also the difference between drawing maybe like 2 cards and drawing like 8 cards. Pretty big deal. So I think that if you do play McCabe, if you just kind of like practice turn 1 unpacks, just do like 5 or 10 of them, just so you can know like, okay, I need to make sure that I have, my corpse curator deployed near basically all the other models in my crew. And then I have another way to drop a scrap marker for the models that are a little further away. That way I can draw more cards. And I mean, figuring out when to activate McCabe, when to activate Luna to get the upgrades out so that the upgrades can then be passed on to other models to give out fast. It gets very complicated. But if you do it a few times and you kind of get the hang of it, then you're going to be okay once you actually hit the table. If you don't really know what you're doing, turn 1 can just turn into a lot of missed opportunity and a lot of analysis paralysis trying to figure out what you're supposed to activate when.
Yeah. I think analysis paralysis is one of the major hurdles that I see from people who are new to the game. And I remember being new to the game and it being a big thing was like, it's like every model has so many different things that it can do, and trying to figure out what the optimal way to play is. That's why a lot of times a game of Malifaux can take 6 hours and it should take 2.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big thing that I would warn people away from, is things that are going to lead to that for sure. Kevin, have you done any looking into McCabe at all?
Yeah, and I actually played against him in my final round at Captain Con this year.
Nice.
He's a ton of fun to play against, so I actually am a little excited to eventually pick him up. But he felt like a little bit of a Rube Goldberg like value engine machine, especially that first turn.
Yeah.
So I could see that being a struggle for newer players. really just any mechanic that restricts the order that you need to activate models in will be confusing at first.
Right.
I'd say like moderately difficult. Just knowing when to get the upgrades. Do I give this guy this or this guy that? What's McCabe doing? Where do I need to go? Because the crew feels like it also wants to be primo. You got Rough Riders who are doing ride with me. You got Hucksters doing stuff. You got the Alleyway Echo, which does add a lot of complexity because it's like you can give them all fast, but you can also take it away and then he'll place and then give them all fast again. And it's just popping across the board.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of nonsense that you can just stumble into and be like, huh, do I have too many upgrades or not enough?
Right.
And then you start to look into like outside of keyword because you can also give the upgrades to not just your friends, but everybody else like a minion, and then it becomes even more complex. So it could be pretty moderate. I do like the crew. I just haven't played it much.
I'd say that, Alleyway Echo, one of the models that you just mentioned, and Host Ducat, one of the other new models that this crew just got.
Yeah.
Those two models really gave this crew a shot in the arm. It's not that it was a bad crew, but like if you play them in 10 Thunders, McCabe's mechanic, the way that he works is he hands out those upgrades, and you can hand them out to either minions or wastrel models. So in what you would do in 10 Thunders a lot of time is you would hire some powerful keyword, like out of keyword minions that you could give the upgrades to. They get fast, they get extra abilities, and bad stuff happens. There weren't really any good, strong out of keyword minions, at least from like an aggressive model standpoint within the Explorers faction. So when they got Alleyway Echo, all of a sudden they had something, the crew has something really good that you can stick the upgrades onto for more than just fast and a couple of other, passive abilities. So that helps like a lot. Not the super easiest models to use because Alleyway Echo can sometimes just die if you don't use it right. So, Host Ducat helps out because he's a healer. Having a healer in the crew is fantastic, but yeah, it definitely helps, and it makes the crew, I think, a little bit easier than it used to be.
So are we thinking moderate or are we thinking complex, if you had to rank it?
I'd probably say moderate. He's not terribly complex.
No, I'd go moderate, because once you get the turn one nailed down, the rest of it just kind of flows, and it's not drastically different than playing a lot of other Malifaux keywords. Yeah. Like you've got your scoring models, you've got your beaters, you've got your, healers to support models, and everything just kind of falls into place.
Yeah, I would say moderate. There's a wide spread of models. You got a lot of humans. You also have a dog, and whatever the corpse curator is, I guess is a scarab on a body. I'm not sure about this one.
It is,
Pretty
yeah,
much,
you're right. Yeah, so it's a cool crew, and again, it kind of goes along with all of this. If you're super into any of these crews, even if we tell you they're hard, that doesn't mean you shouldn't play them, but just know what you're getting into is really what this is about. If you're enjoying this video and you want to support the channel, then there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. The first would be to pick up some merchandise through my merch store. You can grab a t-shirt, a hoodie, a mug, a sticker, all sorts of cool stuff like that. You can also shop using my affiliate links, so if you're going to make any purchases from any of these companies, you can use the links in the description below to make your purchases, and it will go directly to supporting the channel at no extra cost to you. There's also a link for my Ko-fi if you would just like to give me a tip, or my Patreon if you want to support me longer term. I have a bunch of different tiers there, and there are all sorts of benefits available to people, such as early access to videos, ad-free videos, the opportunity to vote in polls about upcoming content, and extra entries into the giveaways that I run occasionally. But if none of that is your cup of tea, no problem at all. Just make sure that you're subscribed to the channel and leave a like on the video. It actually helps a tremendous amount. And if you want to go the extra mile, then consider sharing the video out with some friends who you think might find it interesting. The YouTube algorithm is not kind to small YouTubers, so that helps a whole bunch. Other than that, consider joining the Discord, also linked in the description, where you can come and hang out with me and the rest of the community and talk games. But with that, let's get right back to the video. Next up is Mr. Lord Cooper. I have played against Cooper quite a bit, and my perception of that crew is pretty straightforward. He's kind of like, has big gun, will shoot you. His activations tend to be all about, picking good targets to try to obliterate with his giant cannon. The rest of his crew has a little bit more to it, I think, but nothing that I remember being overly complex. I feel like there's some support models. There's some like models that are about like harassing and stopping opponent models from moving around and things like that, but nothing that was super complicated. I'm gonna switch up the order every couple, but I'll throw it to Jesse again first. What do you think on Cooper?
Yeah, Cooper himself, I think that having a master that's a little simpler to play actually goes a long way towards the rest of the crew being a little bit easier to grasp. You know, you look at a lot of masters in the game and they're far and away the most complicated models in the crew.
Right.
I'm not going to say that Cooper just shoots, but like Cooper 1, like he kind of just shoots. Like there's some other stuff he does, you know, with some healing, some support abilities, but like he shoots. That's pretty much it. The rest of the crew is really about enabling him to get into position, giving him extra focus, and being able to go out and score points while he, you know, shoots his elephant gun. The crew does require a little bit of finesse to play, but like is fast. He's really durable. He's pretty easy to use. The dogs really help. Artemis and Uller help out with like movement and scheming and some added defensive layers. And then the rest of the models in the crew, except for the harpooners, sorry, they're not very good. The rest of the models in the crew are pretty simple to play and do a good job at what they do. Being able to throw pit traps with the Doggy Huntsman, like literally not like throw them like 10 inches away from you, is pretty bonkers. It's real good.
Kevin, any thoughts on Cooper?
I agree. I really like Lord Cooper. I think he's easy to pick up. His card itself sets up adversary by himself, and you know what you want to do with him. You want to shoot with the giant long range gun with the 7 damage. So focus shoot, or find a way to give him focus and shoot. It just does a lot of mileage when you don't have to think about your activation in a turn, which is your master activation. So it reduces the complexity because you don't have to focus on like what do I have to do with him? Which activations, like which abilities on his card do I have to use?
Yeah, options are good because they give you flexibility, but they also make it hard to decide what the good option is. It's there's been quite a few studies on that in like marketing and things where sometimes having too many choices is a bad thing. So if you have a giant cannon that does much damage, that's usually the good option.
Yeah.
Miles, any thoughts on Cooper?
It's a pretty straightforward crew. It is a little bit forgiving because you have predatory instincts. You take a negative to get a positive to damage, so you can force through a lot of damage. The runaways die, but they give out adversary. There's a lot of adversary in this crew, so there's a lot of positive flips you get.
Right.
You're at range and you're fighting.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's a pretty straightforward synergy with the plus to take a minus thing as well. So it works, and it's not like super hard to understand how that works if you know the basic rules of the game.
you got a bunch of hunters, and then you have a T-Rex, a Batman, a hunter, and a couple of dogs. So you know,
Always extra points for the dogs.
Yes. They have 2 best boys, not just one. Most crews only get one. One thing that I think is really important to highlight in terms of like learning the game or learning a new faction is this is a crew that because of predatory instincts and all of the adversary you can put out, you kind of get to ignore or work around one of the core mechanics of the game, which is like plus and minus flips. You know, your whole crew has the ability to just say, all right, I'm going to give myself an extra negative flip on the wound to get a positive flip on the attack. And now all of a sudden you're ignoring things like concealment, friendly fire, that kind of thing.
Certain special defensive tech like serene countenance and things that
serene
apply
countenance. Exactly. And that's very, very rare in the game. Usually you have to like use an action to focus or find a way to put focus onto a model to get around that stuff. And it goes the other way too. Like if you already have a positive flip and you're shooting a model that has like hard to wound, you can just take a negative, still be at a straight flip, and now all of a sudden you have a better chance at getting a straight flip on the damage, which is for the 357 damage track, super critical. But even, I mean, the rest of the models in the crew have pretty good damage tracks as well. So that, I think that kind of, I wouldn't go so far as to say breaking, but like bending one of the core mechanics of the game is going to make this crew a lot more forgiving.
Yeah, it's flexibility, but it's flexibility that you get to decide to use when it's relevant, you don't have to have prepared for that. You don't have to set up the focus or the extra ability to counter your opponent's defenses. You can just say, okay, well, I'm shooting you and I'm going to take a negative to take a positive or vice versa. So there's not a lot of prep that goes into it. You can just decide when it's relevant. So beginner friendly. Everybody sounds like they're pretty on board for that.
Yeah, definitely. I will say that the second version of Cooper is a little bit more complicated. He kind of plays it's like a cross between McCabe and Marcus. There's like more beasts that you have to worry about, like buffing and giving bonuses to. A little bit more complicated, but still not really that bad at all. I'd still say that overall, very beginner friendly.
Cool. All right, so English Ivan. I play against English Ivan a lot, and it's Kevin's fault. And I think I'm a little bit torn on English Ivan because he is beginner friendly for some of the reasons we just said about Cooper, where he ignores a lot of your opponent's defenses. He does a lot of like medium range attacks that just effectively ignore, or actually, in fact, benefit from most of the traditional ways that an opponent would defend against those things. So if they have concealment, friendly fire, all those things, instead of taking detriments, he takes buffs for those things. So that's very forgiving. On the other hand, there are things in his crew that are easy to punish, and there's also a little bit of complexity in setting up some of the like movement interactions that he has, and like his summon it takes a little bit more setup than some crews that can just summon by throwing a soul stone out there. Kevin, what do you think for Ivan?
He strikes me as like a middle of the road in terms of complexity, because again, like Cooper, he has a really easy master activation. You generally know what you want to do with him. Usually you're just trying to put him somewhere advantageous and drop 3 runic siphons into something. Maybe get a summon off if it's advantageous for you. But the rest of his crew has a lot of moving parts that even today I have never done the scoundrel ability on Eva's card. I forget it every single time. I have never used it successfully, and I must have played at least 20 games with the men.
Yeah, there's definitely I wouldn't quite call it like a clockwork mechanism, but there's definitely a lot going on with the crew of like trying to set up things in the right positions. And I think the big thing that for me pushes him at least up until into that middle category is that there's some things in the crew that I think are, if your opponent has the right stuff or knows how to do it, it's easy to get punished playing certain parts of the crew. I figured out certain strategies against Kevin in particular where it's like, I know he's going to take this model and I know how to defeat that model, and I'll just go do it. And then, not that it's trivial, but it is, if you were misplaying it, it would be very easy for your opponent to do that. Miles, what do you think about Ivan? How much experience do you have with him?
I've played against English Ivan a fair amount.
Mhm.
Wow. A scoundrel? Yeah. I don't think I've ever seen that used. I've seen Ava.
What is Scoundrel? You want to tell us what Scoundrel does? Because I don't even remember, because he's never
Scoundrel. At the end of this model's activation, it may look at the top three cards of the opposing player's fate deck and place them back in any order.
Yeah. So things that trigger at the end of a model's activation, famously hard to remember.
Yeah.
It's an interesting keyword. I would say it's definitely a little squishy. I mean, you have the ungentlemanly affairs, which helps a lot, but the crew doesn't put out like a lot of damage. And it does have this weird way of how it's trying to give itself negatives to give itself positives, which turn back into negatives, and then it's just there's a lot of complexity. I would say it's definitely like a McCabe level, if not maybe a little bit higher, because I've also seen somebody pick it up and they play pretty well, and then someone else it doesn't click for them. But the person that it clicked for, it seemed like they were working with the crew, like they had to work like pretty hard just to get things going.
Jesse, what do you think?
So Ivan was the master that got me into Explorer Society. He's the whole reason that I got into the faction, because he has, the models of, if you're talking rule of cool, like I don't think there's many cooler keywords in the game. Like he has like living shadows. It looks like something out of that dope movie Dark City. Like, come on.
I did an entire video. I actually did 2 videos earlier this year specifically on the subject. Well, it was inspired by the fact that he should be in my faction, and I want him in my faction, so I have to agree.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, he's actually brought me back into Malifaux to begin with.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I've, in terms of like crews that I've played in Explorers, I think I've got the most Ivan games in by a decent margin. It is a pretty complicated crew. I think that the thing that makes it complicated is that there's like multiple layers of abilities. And you can kind of just play the crew and drop in 3 ranged attacks with Ivan that give staggered and then go score your points. And like, that's fine. But things like Scoundrel, things like the 3 aura abilities on the front of Ivan's card that, like, I swear 25 plus games in, the number of times that I've remembered to use his Penumbral Converter front of card aura is probably like a third of the times that I should have used it. It's there's a lot of passive abilities. There's a lot of trickiness in the crew to kind of take it to that second level. Like, you look at a model like Corvus Rook, one of his henchmen, that like some people think is garbage, and I love like more than many other models in the game. You look at his model on face and you're like, okay, cool. He's got a stat 7 attack that you can get execute with. So clearly that's what you should be doing with him. And like, no, if you try and play him that way, he's going to underperform. But using a lot of the other things on his card, like the triggers and attacking your own models to, have certain effects. And I think that if you try and play this crew like a regular, like march up the middle and fight your opponent, you're probably going to lose most of the time. If you play the flanks and you know how to apply your AP the right way, it can be super good. That said, there are a couple of crews that can kind of just like blow it out. To your point from before, I think that to get into the crew and learn the core mechanics, it's not that hard. And Ungentlemanly Affairs, to ignore all those negatives, helps tremendously. But to take it up to the second level, I think it takes a lot more work than other crews. So I would say for him, I would if I had to go anywhere, I'd even go like high side of moderately complex to almost really very complex.
I mean, coming into this, I think I probably would have just, based on playing against him, I probably would have put him at like the low tier of high complexity. The other thing I want to throw out, something that you just said kind of reminded me of this, is that in Malifaux, most crews, they have their keyword, and generally you're hiring out of that keyword. You don't necessarily have to. There's ways around that, but typically, and especially when you're new, you're going to be hiring out of that keyword because that's what you're going to own. Usually all the models in a keyword have some similar abilities. So you're going to know that when you're playing this crew, here's this 1 or 2 abilities that every model is going to have access to. Or quite a few of them are going to. Ivan is a weird crew because there's actually 2 different keywords going on. And while that's true within those keywords, they're 2 different ones. So there is a little bit more to even remember, because like the defenses that the DUA models have are slightly different from the ones that the Umbra models have. So that's another thing to sort of try to wrap your head around when you're just getting into it.
Yeah, I remember you used to ask me a ton of questions when I first started playing him, because all my models were so different and they have all these weird defensive abilities too, like the one that makes you discard a card. I can't remember it at the moment.
There's one that I have to discard a card or take a negative, and there's one that if you discard a card, I take a negative. So it's like, that can be hard to remember when you're not, if you don't have a lot of reps with them.
Yeah. And it is a summoning keyword, which like, I think it bears mention that if you are getting into this as a new player, this keyword has one of the larger buy-ins in the faction, because you need Ivan's core box, you need all of the models that you're going to be summoning, plus you need, I mean, realistically, you kind of need like all of the DUA models with maybe a couple of exceptions. So you really do need a lot of boxes to get off the ground with this one. And I think that if anything would make it, I would even go so far as to say that this is not a very new player friendly crew, because of that higher level of complexity and the sheer number of dollars that you need to spend to get into it.
I might be a little biased because I literally learned 3rd edition playing Ivan, But I will say that to your point of him being a complex master, the way I use my DUA and Umbra pieces is still evolving to this day, and he's my most played master. Whereas I can put Yetza down on the table and know what every monster is going to do for the entire game before turn one.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, me too. In the last tournament that I went to a few weeks ago, I played Ivan in the second round, and I played McCabe in the third round. I took the Host Ducat and Alleyway Echo in both crews, and I won the last round game because there were 2 points in the game that I started shooting my own models with Host Ducat using his Derringer, so that getting all these positive flips because I'm getting a positive flip for friendly fire, for concealment. So I'm flipping like 3 cards, and I'm basically just fishing for tomes to get the draw out secrets trigger to drop scheme markers in base contact with my models with no opposed flip. So like that's kind of the level of wacky shenanigans that you can do with this crew that just isn't apparent at first glance.
You just set off some kind of good idea in Miles' head. He's doing research on Ivan now.
Yeah,
now I gotta
he
look the
really-
card. Hang on. Oh.
That's a crew that definitely rewards like out of the box thinking.
So are we thinking high complexity then?
Yeah, high complexity. And, that outside the box thinking is the thing that makes this crew work. If you try and, run it as like a line of beaters or a gun line,
right,
you're probably going to get outperformed.
It just feels like a pillow-fisted Malifaux crew unless you start doing shenanigans with it.
Mm-hmm.
And Malifaux likes shenanigans, so if you're coming into the game wanting to just run into the middle and fight, there's a couple of crews that can do that pretty well. Most can't, or most shouldn't. So, that's not unusual in Malifaux, but I do think it's pretty complex. Go ahead, Miles.
I was just gonna say I see a lot of opinions about the whole crew as a whole, just like diverse, like Corvus being good or bad. And then one thing that keeps popping up is Infiltrator, and it's just like you look at this one model and it's like this does a lot. You take it into Pandora and it's like she can't hurt it, and it's like whoa. But the model dies to like a stiff breeze.
And like a lot of unique mechanics as well, like things that you don't see in other crews, like strange stuff.
Yeah, the friendly thing is hard to remember.
Infiltrator as an ability is probably the most complicated ability in the entire game. You'll never catch every instance that it actually is going to come up in a given game. If any, I will put this out there. If anybody comes to Captain Con at the events I'm running in a couple of months, end of January, beginning of February, if you play an operative or if you play Klaus from Neverborn, the 2 models in the game that have the Infiltrator ability, if you go for an entire game and do not miss a single instance of when that ability should trigger, I will buy you dinner the night of the event. I'm making that commitment right now.
I'm going to find a matchup where it couldn't possibly have been triggered so that the answer is always 0, and then you're going to have to buy me dinner.
That'd mean you'd have to be playing Explorers or Neverborn, so I guess we'll just see. I guess you can play Marcus and Neverborn, right?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there you go.
All right, so Ivan goes at the top, very complex, cool crew. Don't shy away from it, but know what you're getting into. It's going to be a little bit of a learning curve there. So don't be discouraged when you lose a lot of games up front. Me and Kevin have had that exact conversation when he lost like 6 games in a row, and he was like, I don't know, and I was like, I think you just got to learn them, and now it's much closer.
I had to discover that Corvus Rook was actually the best piece in the crew.
He's pretty good. He's pretty good.
What I'm saying.
Yeah, I was really butthurt about him for a long time, saying he's 9 stones. Why am I taking this guy?
Boy.
All right, over to Anya. So I have not seen Anya on the table ever. She's obviously a newer master, so I never saw her in second, and I've never seen her in third. My understanding of her, and I've looked at her crew. She's actually one of the crews one of the first ones I collected in Explorers, and one that I want to play, that I intend to play. My understanding of her crew is that very glass cannony, and maybe more on the glass and less on the cannon. So super easy to get punished, low health, also spends health as a currency, so very easy for your opponent to take you apart. And if you don't punish them first, then you got no cannon and you had a lot of glass. So Kevin, thoughts on Anya? I'm not that familiar with the rest of the crew. I know she's got a very small hiring pool, So that's maybe a plus, but
It's also scattered around a lot of factions, which can be confusing for newer players. But I'd agree. I mean, same problems that Ivan has because they share a lot of similar models. They have Corvus, they have the operatives. Um, a lot of really complex pieces that are super fragile and very easy to punish if they're out of position. So you have to be very aware of threat ranges. Not a lot of defensive tech, and they're pinging themselves for damage on top of that. So definitely a tricky crew to run.
yeah, and one of the things that I worry about when I'm kind of trying to teach a new player, if you're talking about a crew that's very fragile, it means that it's much more important to know what your opponent's capabilities are than a crew that's got some more like straightforward defenses. And the hardest thing about this game is understanding all of the matchups that you might go up against because there's 50 something, 60 something masters, and each of them has 2 versions, and the crews are all, there's a lot there, and a crew that is super easy to be just get your teeth kicked in on turn 2. It really matters what you're up against, because if your opponent can really do the alpha strike, you have to know where it's coming from. You have to know what's going to do it. What how to defend against it. And if you don't know any of that stuff, it's going to be easy to just turn 2. You're just going to concede when you lose half the crew. So I worry about glass cannon crews for new players especially. Miles, any thoughts on Anya and crew?
Anya and crew. I think I've played them a couple times. This totem is just oof. But yeah, Anya herself is a lot of muscle. But that whole price of progress is great, but then you don't have a lot of healing. And it's just it's the same kind of Bayou Europe's Neverborn problem of you're spending a lot of it, do you get any of it back? And it's just how much of it are you willing to spend? How much are you willing to risk it? So the crew feels a little riskier, even if you can actually get all these suits off. Because if you spend it and you miss the attack, then you're just out of it.
Right. Just for folks that are listening, I think price of progress is you can take a point of damage to build in a suit. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, you do it before the flip. I think you would get some serious mileage out of changing that to after the flip, but before cheating.
Right. So basically, before you go into a duel, you have to decide to do it, and then there's a chance you might have gotten it anyway, and it's just
It's happened to me too many times.
Right. But now when we're talking, like Miles was just saying, when we're talking about a crew that is already kind of frail, and you're spending your health to get the most effectiveness out of your offensive abilities, it becomes super super risky. And if you make the wrong move, it's going to be easy to get punished for that. Jesse, anything to add to that?
Yeah. So I actually, aside from Ivan, Anya at this point is my most played master. I've run her a lot. She is, I mean, if you take a look at her, you look at Anya 1 and she's got stat 6 defense and she's got hard to kill and she's only got 10 wounds. So you're like, okay, I probably going to lose my master if I'm not careful with them. Now, she does have some inbuilt ways to get healing. And, it's a little deceptive because she is swinging with arguably one of the best attack actions in the game. It's a stat 7 with a trigger on every suit. One of the triggers gives her +1 damage and heals her for 1. So being a stat 7, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to hit. And then you can bake in the suit for a siphon life every single time, or just cheat or ram for it that you're probably going to, succeed in the duel with anyway because of the high stat. And then she also has this really unique thing where after she does her damage flip, she can look at the top 2 cards of her deck and then discard any of them that she doesn't want and then put the rest back on top. So basically what happens with her is, you hit once and you're probably going to hit again, and then you're probably going to hit the 3rd time almost without a doubt, and you're going to know what you're flipping every single time. So you can use those siphon lives, you can use stones. So as long as she doesn't get blown out, you can usually rebound and, pick your health back up. But there's a real art to that. It's definitely not very new player friendly, and I don't want to get into like a whole deep dive on this crew, but kind of the whole crew plays like that.
Yeah.
I will say, I know we're kind of talking about, new player friendly stuff and sticking to keywords. If there's any crew in the entire faction that benefits from other outside of keyword or versatile models that can give out shielded, it's this crew. If you take like Bellhop Porter or the Emissary, the Intrepid Emissary, to give out shielded, all of a sudden those price of progresses aren't actually hurting you because it's not irreducible damage, and it's not that you just lose health, you take damage. So that adds a big buffer to make the crew a lot more forgiving. And then some of the new models that they got really help kind of fill the gaps in the keyword. So if we were talking like last year before the new round of releases came out, I would say that this is probably not a very good crew in general and is definitely not new player friendly. I still would say it's probably not very new player friendly, but it's a heck of a lot better than it used to be. And when played right, I mean, she's brutal, just absolutely brutal. So I would say she's probably on the high side of medium complexity because the rules aren't actually very difficult to master. It's basically you're just playing basic Malifaux, but you're kind of riding the razor's edge the whole time. You lean too far in either direction and you start losing models, and then the whole crew falls apart.
My objection to putting her in the middle, though, would be that of all the things that you just described as kind of ways to make those mechanics work effectively, they're adding complexity, not reducing it, right? So you're talking
That's
you
fair.
have to look at the cards and understand what they mean and know how to prepare for the weird eventualities that might come up and what that's going to mean for the next two attacks. It also means that you have to buy more models and also look at more models because you're not just saying here's the 10 models that are in this keyword. Now I have to look at versatiles and add keyword picks and stuff like that. So those things I think all make her less.
Yeah, I would say she's not
friendly?
overly complex, but I would say she's definitely not new player friendly. Let me revise my statement. Yep.
I would say the Intrepid Emissary is a good buy for almost every master and explorers, though.
Yeah.
So you're adding a model that you would add in general as an explorer's player.
Yeah. Plus the emissaries all look awesome. Like anybody who's getting into a faction is probably going to want to pick them up because they're all great models.
That's fair. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's also easy to make him look amazing because stonework is insanely easy to paint. You just dry brush it.
Well, I will say, and this is something that Miles brought up. I can definitely see collecting this crew being complicated because it's very unintuitive to think that you need to buy the starter box for a different faction that doesn't actually have any other keyword models, and they're also kind of like core models of this crew. It's and you have to now buy these other models that are Arcanists, not explorers at all, and you can only hire into this crew. Like it's not the easiest crew to collect.
I think I'm really leaning towards Anya goes in not new player friendly.
I agree. Not new player friendly.
Yeah.
We're gonna go with that.
Yeah.
Especially if you're
for
the
almost
kind of
all the reasons.
Yeah.
I think Anya too also ramps up the complexity a little bit.
God,
Yeah, she feels like mono blue control and Magic the Gathering. It's very complex and it can all fall apart if you make one or two mistakes.
Yeah, let's take a master that has 10 wounds and then take away one of her defense, so she's only 5, and take away hard to kill. So, yeah, that's not going to be a problem at all, right?
Yeah, I think Explorers, we were joking about this before we started recording, but I think Explorers is like a faction of fairly not beginner friendly. Like Jitch generally is not considered very beginner friendly, and I think she's one of the reasons. And speaking of the reasons, Nexus. So I think Nexus is one of the masters that comes up often in the conversation of like, if you're going to tell someone who not to start Malifaux with, Nexus is one of those people. I've played against Nexus a few times, both versions, and it's a combination of a pretty big hiring pool. There's quite a few models. There's quite a few very unique and like one-off mechanics. She's got this thing where she like gives out parasite tokens and then has a bunch of abilities that interact with those parasite tokens. So not only is it a unique mechanic that you don't see a lot in other crews, but it's also something that requires a lot of prep and then understanding how to, once you have that setup done, understanding how to make other things work with it. There's also like abilities that are transforming your models and like upgrading them. Her title version has multiple small children that are the master instead of it being one model. it's like when I played against it, I had no idea what my opponent was doing. I was just like, I'm just taking your word for it that this is all legal, that you're doing this correctly. I don't know. I have no idea what you're actually doing. So right off the bat, I'm going to say she's probably going in top tier. But Kevin, what are your thoughts on Nexus?
I agree entirely. I mean, I literally tried to learn the crew over the past week. Just I was trying to refamiliarize myself with all of the Explorers crews, and I'm still not 100% sure what this crew actually does when you put it on the table. I mean, the totem has weird deployment timings, has the same thing that Jesse was mentioning with Cooper, where you can put it super far forward and just lose it right away. It's move 3, so if you do position it badly, it's just not doing anything for you the whole game.
Mm-hmm.
And all the crews, like every single model in the crew, seems to do its own thing. And it looks like they're supposed to interact with each other, but I can't quite put the pieces together. Like, I'd literally need to build this crew, put it on the table, and play it out. I can't even theory craft it. I can't figure out what I'm supposed to do to play this at a high level.
Yeah. Yeah, it's super weird. Like I said, when I played against it, I was like, I don't understand any of this stuff that's going on. It was happening in front of me, and they were explaining it, but I was like, I don't know what you're doing. Just do your thing. And then they beat the crap out of me, and I was like, all right, well, that was fun, I guess.
You deserved it.
Yeah, you have to ask them to repeat. Like, what did you say? Parasite tokens do again?
It was
10
was
times.
gonna be so much of that I was just like, it's fine. Just do your thing and kill my thing, and that's fine. We'll just move on.
Let's see. I played against it once, and it was a lot of. It looks like my draft in the home was like here's a bit and a bit and a bit, and then like you kind of just have to have like a full picture of it, and then you're still gonna be like, wait, but what's going on over here? And what's going on over here? And there's a lot of little sneaky stuff like the ability omnipresent influence. This model may draw line of sight and range for its actions from friendly captain's model within 12-inch or. And it's like, that's huge. And so you can just like smack somebody from across the table because you're doing that. And you also have like stuff like spell leaders where they're stealing suits from the enemy. And then the biggest thing about Nexus 1 is Will Cadmus, where it's like, oh, take a parasite, take another parasite, damage. And then it's like, oh, at the end of the turn, every model activate, I could take another activation. But I only do this one thing, and it's like, oh, this is a lot of stuff that you're just like,
Yeah, a lot of moving parts and a lot of stuff that you have to plan for, right? A lot of stuff that needs prep. You can't just. It's not like Lord Cooper where you can just say, okay, well, I will activate, I will run towards you, then I will shoot you with cannon. It's a lot of like, I need to have the right things in the right places. I need to make sure that I give you the parasite token and have everything positioned correctly, and then it works. Jesse, thoughts on Nexus?
Yeah, I mean, arguably the most complex crew in the game. I don't think that there are many others that give it much of a run for its money. Bonus points, they do have one of the coolest ability names in the game on Dr. Stanley, A Fungus Among Us. It's fantastic. So like Rule of Cool again, and like the models are absolutely stellar. Like the whole thing looks
Here's what
phenomenal.
I'll say about the crew, right? If it's your thing, it's really going to be your thing, and if it's not your thing, it's really going to not be your thing.
Yeah, you got to be okay with spiders and creepy crawlies.
Right. And if you're not, then
not going to be great. Yeah, I mean, you guys have pretty well summed it up. It's a super cool crew. It's got a really, really, really high skill ceiling, but it also has a really high skill floor.
Yeah.
It's tough to get there and actually make it work. I guess low floor, high floor. I always mess that up.
Low floor. It's hard to.
Low floor.
Or I'm sorry, high floor. It's hard to get there. It's hard to get up.
Yeah, we know what we're talking about. We're probably saying it wrong, but yeah, it's a fantastic crew. I mean, Night Silk Creeper is probably one of my favorite models in the game, and I think it's very Malifaux, which is super cool. But yeah, I would never suggest that anybody start the game with this keyword.
Yeah, if you're watching this video still, just don't play her. Like if you're concerned about this subject, this should be at least your second master, if not third.
Yeah, for sure.
It's gonna be a very difficult time. Maybe if there's someone in your meta, if you're lucky enough to like have a local meta and there's like somebody that plays her or at least has played her and can like help you, that might be the exception. Or if you're like really into studying and working on it, but otherwise, not great.
I will say that if you do decide to go against our advice and start playing her as your first master, if your opponents don't know how to deal with parasite tokens,
Fair.
they're going to have a bad day and you're not going to have to work that hard for it. So there is that.
Yeah, that's fair.
Oh, I kind of want to build a Nexus crew now.
Here we go.
I already have Somer and Hamlin and Wong.
Oh,
Check-
yeah. Yeah, you
Check
need
Oh,
more
God.
epic
Discord.
quality.
Check the Discord the day after this video goes up, and let's see if we have pictures of Miles' new crew. All right, over to Maxine. So Maxine, I think when they announced Explorers, Maxine was the master that I was the most excited about. I thought it was a really cool idea. She's like a nerdy scientist lady with a bunch of like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen type people on her boat, and they go around and do science. I still haven't played her. I keep meaning to. I haven't yet. But the thing about her crew that it is, I'm curious what all the rest of you think about this, of whether this like counts for her or against her in terms of new player approachability. But she's got a lot of things that deal with cards, that manipulate cards. So like there's abilities that mean that cards of certain suits count as different numbers, and that's something that on the one hand I think is somewhat forgiving, because you can see that, one of tomes in your hand and be like, well, I'm gonna get value out of this one of tomes, even though otherwise I wouldn't have. But the cards and the suits and like understanding how to strategize around the cards is a big part of the skill and the tactics of playing Malifaux, and adding complexity to that, I feel like for a brand new player might make that harder to learn. So I'm not sure how I think that cuts, and I guess I guess on the whole I'm leaning towards putting her in the middle because of that. But I'm curious what everybody else thinks and what you think about the rest of the crew, because I'm not as familiar. Miles, any games with or against Maxine?
EVS, I think I've played against it a few times. It seemed just the base, because I don't have, but against my opponent, it seemed like he had a pretty good handle on it, and just being able to count like your weak cards as like a 9 definitely helped in like the recovery and what you want to be doing. It's a very nautical theme. And you also have one of the best buy rimmers, Bo Fishbacher, and Bo just shows up everywhere in value and probably shows up in like all the Maxine lists.
Thoughts on like, does that make her you think she's approachable because of that? Was this a new player that you're talking about that you're facing, or
this was an experienced player. I would say after you've gotten over the kind of weirdness about how you want to set your deck up, it seems like you're just getting whatever you want.
Okay, Jesse, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that if you can learn the core mechanics that go across the crew, which are basically like deep discovery and reconfigure, and we've kind of alluded to them a little bit, but reconfigure, most of the models in the crew have it. Typically they'll have it on a suit, so reconfigure tome or reconfigure ram, whatever. Basically, when this model cheats fate, they can treat any card of that suit as having a value of 9. So basically any cards value 1 through 8 can instead count as a 9. And there are occasionally circumstances that you can even cheat a severe down to a moderate, which you wouldn't think would come up very often, but I've seen it happen. You need to do it. If you need to keep a model alive and you flip that severe, you're like, no, we're going to cheat it down. So, at any rate, the core mechanics that go into like the deck and hand manipulation and utilizing the right cards at the right times is a little complicated, and to your point, it makes the whole card mechanic a little more intimidating to learn in the first place. And being able to use deep discovery to cheat with the top card of your opponent's discard pile is also tough to really kind of figure out the right timing for. But aside from that, the models in the crew are pretty straightforward. Like, they're not overly complicated. There's a couple of passive abilities here and there. For the most part, the backs of their cards are pretty cut and dry. It's like melee attack and a ranged attack. You do have toss on the Tide Caller, which is a great ability. But I think that if you can just kind of figure out those two core mechanics, the rest of the crew is super easy to run. And the way that the card manipulation works, basically, like, if you need to win a duel, you're probably going to win the duel. like almost every time. And that really, really helps with learning the game. You just have a lot more flexibility with your hand and what you can do with it.
Interesting. Yeah, the thing I'm kind of stuck on is like, does it making the cards more complicated make it much harder to learn if you're fresh, like this is the first crew you're playing, or does that actually like reduce make it a little bit more forgiving and therefore reduce the complexity? I'm still kind of torn on that. Kevin, what do you think about Maxine?
I would put Maxine under intermediate purely because like the reconfigure mechanic and all of her base abilities are better if you already know the core mechanics of the game, like the card flipping, the cheating, if you're already comfortable with the game. So like if you were already a Malifaux player, you don't have any Explorers models and you wanted to jump into Explorers, great first master to pivot to because she's easy to learn. Her models are a lot of fun, and she has like a lot of bad hand fixing, but you're going to need to plan your activations in advance, know which cards to hold back for reconfigure, stuff like that. It's not easy to do if you're just trying to figure out what suits are in the first place.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think putting her somewhere in the middle makes some sense, because even as a new player, like if you want to take the time to learn the mechanics that well before you play and like get a good grasp of it, I think it's doable. But I do think it's potentially going to make it a little bit more confusing than if you were playing a more traditional crew that didn't manipulate the cards.
Yeah, also Maxine 2's leyline mechanic requires a lot of game knowledge to pull off correctly without endangering her.
Yeah.
All right, second to last here we have Jedza. So I've played against Jedza quite a bit, and I think she's the worst. So I think Jedza is forgiving to play because she's got a lot of healing mechanics and a lot of ways to stop your models from dying, which is good because if you're new and you get alpha struck, then it makes it hard to learn and frustrating and all that stuff. So I think she's very forgiving, but I also think that she's got a lot of abilities that trigger during other models' activations, and I think that's very hard to remember, even as an experienced player. That's something that people are always getting wrong. We've called out a few different abilities on other cards, on other models, just in this conversation, and it's like everything in her crew. Everybody's got one of them. I think that she's got a lot of really good models in her crew. I think they do a lot of good things that are in and of themselves somewhat straightforward. But I think the fact that a lot of it requires certain auras and all these kind of different things that are intermingling with each other, I think that makes it a little bit harder, especially if you're brand new, to keep track of all that stuff. It also seems to me like you kind of need to get a lot of different stuff for Jedza.
Yeah.
I could be mistaken about that. I don't remember how the boxes are packaged now. Maybe it's easier than I'm thinking, but it seems like there's quite a bit of stuff, so you might need to pick up. You might need to make a couple of extra purchases compared to some other crews. Miles, thoughts on Jedza?
It's a very interesting keyword. It's very, I think somebody described it as Final Fantasy esque because it's very fancy based. You got a bunch of healing going on. It's a lot of ores. It's a lot of, I hate to say it, but kind of like a Bayou kind of feel to it. It's like, I'm going to hurt the friend. I'm going to heal him up. And I'm just going to read that kind of bones. I'm just kind of build up that thing over and over and over again.
Yeah.
It's kind of a slow crew. It's kind of a slow moving bubble. So that would help a new player get into the game. But you might run into that block of, well, I actually need to be way over there. And it's like, this crew is not going to get over there. So you might struggle into like those more difficult matchups because you can also dismantle them pretty easily as well.
Yeah, the bubble crew thing is kind of a two-edged sword because it's like, okay, as long as you guys are all near each other, then all your abilities proc off each other, but it also means that if you miss position, you get punished for that because then you're not getting all those benefits. And I think, like, off the top of my head, I'm sure Jesse and Kevin will talk more about this, but they have some mobility mechanics, but they're non-traditional. Like, they're nothing in the crew is, well, there's a few things in the crew that are somewhat fast, but most of the crew is pretty slow. But there's like abilities that you can push your friendly models around with and things like that that they're actually very effective, but you have to know how to do them and you have to prepare for that. So not as straightforward. Jesse, thoughts on Jedza?
Yeah, I would say she's pretty complex in some sense, but also not very complex in others. I think you referred to her as forgiving, and if you're trying to learn the core mechanics of the game, there's few better ways to do it than just having your models not die.
Yeah.
I mean, anybody who's ever taken a new model to be like, oh, I'm going to try out, my host Ducat for the first time this game.
God
it's like
forbid you just
guaranteed.
painted them. They're
Yeah,
dead.
you just painted them. Your opponent kills them first every time. It's brutal.
Yep,
this crew doesn't really have that problem. So like your models are going to stick around as long as you kind of stick within your bubble. I will say that because of the way the crew works and how the mobility is tricky and the couple of quick models you have aren't like super durable.
Yeah.
There are some strat and scheme pools that you just might kind of really struggle to score your points in. I think that that's kind of a secondary concern because if you're really just focusing on learning the game and learning how the crew works, I do think that this crew definitely has some legs. You might not score 8 points, but you're probably always going to be able to score 4 or 5, and you're probably going to have fun doing it because when your models don't die, it tends to be more fun, generally speaking. So I would actually say that this is just a moderately complex crew, and in terms of like new player appeal, I this might sound crazy. I would even say that this is a pretty new player friendly crew. The aesthetics are really cool. Yes, you do need to buy a good number of boxes if you want to collect the whole thing, but there's a couple of different ways to build the crew, so you don't necessarily have to get all of it. You can just kind of get a couple of core models and then decide where you want to build from there. And like I said, if your models don't die, you get more of an opportunity to play the game.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that. It's something it's come up in a couple of conversations I've had recently of just like, especially when you're first learning, just being able to get those reps in and like the number of activations, having all your models there still on turn 5 means that you've just done more things, you've thought about more things, you've tried more things, and that experience is what helps you get a really good handle on the mechanics.
And that was kind of one of the big knocks that we had on Anya. We were like, yeah, her models just kind of die.
Right.
So that's going to make it hard to learn how to play the crew in the game. This crew is exactly the opposite. It is slow instead of fast. It doesn't hit very hard, but your models just don't get killed.
Yeah. If everybody kills Anya turn 2 of the first 3 games you play and you never got to do anything with her, then you still don't know how to play her, and that's not going to happen with Jedza.
And with Jedza, you can just play Jedza 2 and all of a sudden you're hitting people for irreducible. So you can actually kill stuff.
That's why I say I hate her.
Right.
That irreducible damage. There's nothing your opponent can do. You just kill them.
It's brutal.
Kevin, I know Jedza is one of your favorites. What are your thoughts on complexity and approachability?
I would say she's actually really easy to pick up and learn how to play. I mean, I learned Jedza 2 at Captain Con, basically going in with one practice game under my belt, and just learned how to play her that weekend. Know her like the back of my hand. I ran the same list every single game. I never felt disenfranchised by that because she can kind of do a little bit of everything with like her core pieces. Having the Kurgan is really forgiving for positioning. The one thing I would say that makes her difficult to play is the Chronicles, because you heal something and all of a sudden you have 8 effects you have to remember, because she is a bubble crew. A lot of them are like little pushes and stuff, and I will say that like playing on a clock, those were the first things I cut. I was like, I'm not going to take 4 different 2 to 1 inch movements, some of which were in the wrong direction anyway. But I would say easy to learn, easy to start playing and have fun with. Difficult to squeeze every drop of water out of that sponge, because she does have a lot of moving parts. And learning how to use Yedza 2's like weird attack patterns with like geode markers, or if you're smart and you buy the Vitagi Huntsman, the pit trap markers, that can be difficult to figure out at first. I think it was like 4 or 5 games in before I realized I could ping multiple people with my geode markers. You don't have to just move it right up and slap someone. You can kind of like pinball it around your opponent's models if they're generous enough to keep them clumped together. But you get to do big swings of irreducible damage and just remove models. It feels like a lot of fun. And on the other hand, with Yetza 1, your models are just not moving anywhere. Your crew is going to be whole from the beginning to the end, unless you're not as mindful about your positioning, and you move the damned a little too far forward out of her little save me bubble, and then he's just going to die immediately, and that's where like some of the new player unfriendliness can come into play.
Yeah. And one thing that I'd bring up about the crew is, with the exception of surveyors, because surveyors, like, kind of most of their shtick is the way their chronicle works. If you're just picking up this crew, I just tell people, like, just don't worry about the chronicles. They're not critical to learning how to play the game or play the crew. Most of the things that the majority of them do are relatively small effects, and trying to kill yourself trying to remember every instance that every single one of these things is going off it's going to give you an aneurysm. They are complicated, but honestly, they are not a make or break for running the crew. Like, you learn how the crew works, and then you remember when all the chronicles actually happen. But if you try and do it in the other way, and you just like focus on getting your chronicles off every time, you're just going to get stuck, and it's going to take forever. So I tell people, just pretend they don't exist. You don't need them.
Yeah, that was going to be my question: is can a new player completely forget about them, or mostly forget about them, and still have a decent game as a new player? And if the answer to that is yes, I'd be inclined to put her in new player friendly, because she is pretty forgiving, and a lot of things she has are pretty strong and solid.
Yeah.
And
there's a couple of them that you do have to remember. Like Yedza 1's, like half of Yedza 1 shtick is her chronicle. It's pretty important. And then if you play surveyors and you want to actually have geodes, then that's the only way you can put them down. So you have to remember that. But aside from that, like, you really don't have to use them, especially now that, what do you call it? Her henchman there. What the heck is his name?
Mikhail.
Mikhail. Especially now that Mikhail's chronicle is toned down from the way that it was when he first came out, where he was like teleporting all over the place.
Yeah.
You still need it because it's kind of one of the ways that he moves out of activation, but it's not the end of the world if you just don't use it every time.
So is everybody thinking recommend new player friendly? Yeah.
Absolutely, new player friendly.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. That's not where I thought she'd come down, but I think I'm on board.
Yeah, maybe like a step above fast and complexity. So pretty simple.
Yeah. Cool. All right. And last but not least, Miss Tiri. I think she's probably the master I know the least about in the game. And if I was a responsible person, I would have read about her whole crew before we did this. And I didn't, because I'm not a responsible person. So what I know about Tiri is that she has a weird mechanic. And I don't know if it's very good, but I know it's weird enough that I don't even know what it does. So I know her crew is cool as hell. The models are dope, but aside from building them, I haven't yet painted them or spent much time thinking about them or ever facing them. So hopefully some of you have. Miles, any experience with Tiri and Co?
Tiri. Yeah. There's a local that likes them. They're
Well, you're in Texas and you have a local that likes everything because all the Malifaux players are in Texas, which is not fair.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you got to stop hogging them.
Sorry. Come to Texas. We have tournaments like every month.
I know.
And like we have a GT like what, twice a year now?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I would say they're pretty forgiving. They have a lot of armor. They have a lot of shielded. There's some hard to wound, and they give out tons of shielded. And it's definitely a crew that is impressive on paper. It's definitely forgiving. Yeah.
Mostly just because of the tankiness from the armor and the shielded and stuff, you think?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
When you get the shielded up, you have, what's it called? Oh, Scars of Truth. When you have shielded, you can add homes. And then when you have that and you're near your master, Tiri 1, you are drawing a card every time you declare a trigger. So there's just a whole bunch of stuff that's just like, oh, I like this. I like this more. Oh, yes, have this. And it's just
extra
it's
value.
it's a lot of positive feedback that it works. It's simple and it's kind of straightforward to be doing all this stuff.
Yeah, added value stuff is definitely good as long as you remember that you have it, which may or may not be a thing. Jesse, thoughts on Tiri?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the stuff that we were just saying about Yedza, where like, hey, if your models don't die, you actually get a chance to play the game. well, Tiri is like that, except your models don't all have to stay next to each other to make that happen. You know, you've got good stats across the keyword for the most part. You've got lots of armor. You've got lots of shielded. You've got multiple different sources of healing. You've got ways to like get your models up the field really fast. You've got some really hard hitting ones in the keyword. I mean, you've got, you know, a relic hammer and you've got the Iron Matron with a great sword. Like that's pretty good. Come to find out. I would say that this is it might be the easiest and most new player friendly keyword in the faction. It's pretty easy to operate. The whole like relic or the whole upgrade flipping crew mechanic is really not very complicated to grasp. If you're trying to maximize things, then yeah, there are ideal points that you're going to flip the upgrade, but you can kind of just start with the upgrade on one side and you're probably okay if you don't really flip it for the rest of the game.
It sounds like the theme here is the Explorer Society has a lot of things that are complicated with a lot of options, but you don't need to use all the options because they're just good no matter what you do.
And that's kind of the way this keyword works. Like like Miles was saying, you're playing Tier 1 and you're just like casually drawing 6 or 7 cards on turn 1 just for existing. And then pretty good. It's super good keyword. It's not like crazy powerful or anything like that. But it's just overall very solid, very relatively easy to operate. And, you know, it's got the resource generation and the durability to back it up.
Nice. Kevin, have you looked into Tiri much? I know she's I think pretty low on your like interest list of the masters that you've expressed interest in playing at least.
Yeah, I'm not.
Which is crazy.
I mean, the models look great, but the gameplay just feels a little stagnant to me. Like, I like the flipping of the upgrade, but it feels like there's a lot of obvious choices there, where like you want it on one side for most of your turn.
Yep.
Maybe you flip it over for 1 or 2 models. I think there's a lot of right decisions that are made for you with the crew, which makes it super easy to run. I would put it as very new player friendly. And just like having shielded as a mechanic is forgiving in and of itself. You know, like encouraging new players to make their own models tankier and then draw cards for that as like an afterthought.
Yeah.
That's a GG for anybody. You know, like anybody could look at that crew and start running it right away effectively.
Sweet. Yeah, I think recommend new player friendly. Go to town with Tiri. She's super cool. Very interesting from a lore perspective as well, and lots and lots of cool models. I built them all recently, and they're a little tricky to build, but they're very cool. All right, so I think that covers all 9 crews. Let's do a really quick lightning round. The opposite of this question, well, sort of the opposite in some way. New player who is looking to get a crew to be their opponent's crew that they're giving demos to. So a lot of times I talk to people who are like, it's me and my significant other, and I'm going to get 2 crews, and one's for me and one's for them. Or, you know, something that they want to bring to the friendly local game store to put on demos for. What, of the 9 Explorers crews, what is a easy one to go up against as a new player, and what is one that you really don't want to go up against as a new player? So sort of the opposite of the question, not complexity of playing them, but how frustrating is it to play against them? Just give me like a least frustrating, most frustrating. You don't have to list them all. Just give me like a one choice for each, if that makes sense. My thoughts, just to start it off, would be Jedza is who you don't want to go up against. So don't give demos against Jedza. I don't think Anya would be a great matchup to go up against because she can punish you really hard. I think maybe Cooper is a safe choice to go up against because he's got his trick and it's a good trick, but there's ways to kind of mitigate it, and you can have an interesting match without it like being super frustrating. Jesse, what are your thoughts quick?
Yeah, I would say Yedza, not something that you want to play into or play against as a new player. Nexus is very much the same. And I would say good choices would be McCabe, Cooper, Bass. I would put Anya in there. Just because, well, maybe not. No, I'll go McCabe, Cooper, and Bass.
I feel like with Anya, it'll be very swingy. Like either you're gonna get
It's
or
very
you're
swingy.
gonna
Yeah.
stop.
Yeah. And I do feel like Tiri is probably not a great choice just because her crew can be kind of a lot to deal with. Like it's just playing as a new player into a Tiri crew. You're just like, dude, I'm using all my AP. I'm not doing any damage. And then when I do, you're just healing it. Like this is not fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Any opponent that has all the cards is gonna be tough. Kevin, thoughts? A top choice and a bottom choice?
My top choices are the same. It's Cooper, Base, and McCabe. I mean, McCabe 2 especially has that Indiana Jones vibe. You get to see Luna, the best girl in Malifaux.
Oh yeah.
Just like throwing the relics around is super funny. So it's fun to play against. Like the first time I ever saw it, I was laughing just as much as my opponent when his stuff went off. Cooper is easy to wrap your head around as an opponent. You know, like try to break line of sight to Cooper. Don't let him see your important models. You know, maybe do some body blocking or save your big cards for his activation. So it's easy to play around his game plan. And then base is it's a cool keyword. Very simple to run. It's not going to confuse your opponent.
And then Jedza and Nexus for the opposite.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And Ivan too. I wouldn't put anyone up against Ivan because like they might try to go into concealing because they know you have guns or something, and then all of a sudden, oh well, you just helped me. So it's a lot of rules for your opponent to memorize. I wouldn't want that. Like the sheer amount of questions you asked me about Ivan, I would never run it against a new player if I could avoid it.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Miles.
Let's see. Bass, pretty easy, simple, nice theme. McKay, pretty simple and easy. I almost want to say Nexus, not having a new player play it, but playing against it might not be a bad idea. It's like, oh, you have a ton of models. Oh, they're dying. And all of a sudden it's like, wait, Parasite token. And then it's like, they start to they start to realize that, oh, there's something else going on in the game. You're doing something completely different than what I'm doing, than trying to kill him. It's like, oh, it's a Parasite. And then it's like, hey, check out this thing I did in the phase. And it's like, what? So that might be an interesting demo of
It's
the
a
game is bigger
than
what you expected.
Right. Yeah. That's an interesting point. You get to teach them some lessons that may not be like frustrating, but you can learn from it.
Yeah. If you ever want to sit across the table and watch somebody play their own game, there's no better way to do it than play against Nexus.
Yep, that was the experience I had as well. So I think I would probably lean away from Nexus, but I do think that's an interesting point that Miles made. So, all right, well, I hope that was helpful for people. Hopefully, I don't have to type out like novel length responses to people on Reddit anymore when they ask this question. I can just send them a link and be like, if you have questions, ask me. But yeah, thank you guys all for being here. Let's really quick. Do you have anything that you want to plug? I'm sure you do, Jesse. What's up? What's going on? Where can people find you on the internet?
Yeah, for sure. Before that, I just wanted to make one kind of closing point on Explorers that I think applies to this faction more than most other factions in the game. There's a lot more in keyword synergy with basically every crew in this faction than anywhere else really that I've seen, to the point that you don't really feel like you need to buy a bunch of those versatiles and out of keyword models. You can really buy the models for the keyword and just play that. Honestly, in Explorers, the only thing that I really take outside of the keyword that I'm playing is the Intrepid Emissary and maybe one or two things otherwise. It makes, I think, the crews have a much more cohesive feel, which is really, really cool for a new player. So, yeah, very cool.
Sticking in theme.
Yeah. And in terms of stuff I'm plugging, yeah, absolutely. Check out the Boring Conversation podcast. We just released an episode about actually new players and their experiences getting into the game, learning it, as opposed to some other games like Infinity and some other systems that they like to play. I think that it came out pretty well. And if you are interested in playing, especially in person, we have some really cool events coming up at Captain Con the first weekend of February, last weekend of January there.
And probably 3 people on this camera.
Yeah, probably.
And hopefully Miles too, and it'll be all 4 of us.
There you go.
Got a bunch of PTO.
Yeah. So I'm going to be running a 3-person team tournament at Captain Con Saturday and Sunday, 5 rounds. Big emphasis on team spirit. I'm encouraging people to have, they want to dress up in costumes, if they want to have team chants, if they want to have walk up music like a wrestling match, like go for it, man. The sky's the limit. There's going to be some special awards for team spirit. And I think that, it's all well and good to win some games, but if you're playing in a 5-round event and you've lost your first 3 games going into day 2, it can just feel like a slog.
Yeah.
With this kind of event, the way that pairings work and the amount of emphasis we're putting on team spirit, it's really my hope that every single person is going to have a great experience every single round, all the way through the event. So it's going to be a ton of fun. And if you don't want to play in a 2-round, 2-day, 5-round event, I've got a 1-day, 3-round event on Friday. You can come do that and then just go play other stuff in the con, whatever you want.
And all the cool people will be there, so it's always good to come.
That's the hope.
Yeah. Anyway, Kevin, any final thoughts on Explorers or things you want to plug? Where can people find you on the internet? You don't do social media except Discord, so.
Yeah, I'm a ghost on the internet pretty much.
Except Discord, you're always on Discord.
Yeah, that's fair. I'll say that even though Ivan is one of the more complicated masters that we listed today, I have immensely enjoyed learning to play Malifaux with him as a crew. Like, my gameplay is constantly evolving. I feel like every time I go there, I learn something new about the crew. And while the first few games were frustrating, I wouldn't trade it for anything. I love playing Ivan. I love the fact that his models encourage you to do different game plans. Like, I play him more than Yedza, who's way easier to get a W with for a reason, because he's just genuinely more fun, more interesting to play, while also being the source of like 90% of those Malifaux headaches that people complain about.
That's part of the fun, though. I mean, if you're not into that, why are you playing this game? Yeah. Miles, any closing thoughts or places people can find you on the internet?
No, just looking at Nets' stuff now. I'm like, okay, yeah, I've been away from the game because I've been studying and working. And now I'm like, yeah, I do need a more complicated crew. I have a couple, but I don't have all of them. I don't have anything to plug besides hydrate, take more naps, relax. That's what I tell myself during this stressful time of school year.
Well, hopefully you'll be able to start getting some games in again pretty soon, but I know what that's like, believe me.
5 weeks.
For a long time I never played.
5 weeks.
Yeah, awesome.
School's
well,
over.
Thank you all for coming. I appreciate it. I think that was hopefully very helpful for some new players, and stay tuned because this will be an 8-part series because there's 7 more factions to talk about. So we'll be back probably in a month or so with some other stuff. Huge thank you to the extremely cool kids here on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatize, and Devin. And thanks for watching.